Hello and welcome back. Epic Treatise here. Today we're going to be looking again at Metatron's video about the truth about LGBTQ plus in ancient Greece. So let's get straight into it.
Using this approach to try and identify LGBTQ ideology through historical evidence, we cannot and should not try and project and overimpose modern identity concepts, classifications, and even nomenclature onto the minds of ancient people.
I couldn't agree more. They didn't categorize these things in the same way we categorize them, and they didn't think about them in the same way we think about them. So we ought to be careful about the language we use to describe same-sex relationships or interactions between, or sexual interactions between people of the same sex in the ancient world, and not impose a modern terminology on them.
In other words, as we will see on this video, being gay in 2023 is not the same as being gay in the 5th century BC in Athens.
We just agreed that you can't use modern terms to describe sexual contact between people of the same sex in the ancient world as you use in the modern world. And then you go immediately and say being gay in the ancient world or being gay in 5th century Athens. So you immediately break your own rule.
And how could it be? So in reality, I would avoid even attaching the word LGBTQ+ to the ancient world, because this word is too connected to modern filters, and it comes loaded with its own baggage of interpretations and expectations thereof.
Which is why we shouldn't talk about being gay in ancient Athens. This sort of modern terminology isn't very helpful.
Not to mention that whenever this person says ancient Greece, they are trying to install this false concept of all the Greeks everywhere in Greece thought the same thing, thought the same way, whereas we know that different cities had different legal and societal positions towards such practices. And of course, these are not cities of a nation in the modern sense. These are city-states, single district units of political organization. The enforcement of morals in classical city-states differed monumentally between them. Some allowed it, some ignored it, some were ambiguous about it, and some completely prohibited it.
So this is one of the boldest claims that Metatron has made so far. Some polis allowed it, some polis ignored it, others were ambiguous towards it, and some completely prohibited it. Well, ignoring it and being ambiguous about it is essentially the same as allowing it, so let's ignore those for a start. Some allowed it. Well, yes, obviously some allowed it. Some prohibited it. Well, I can find no source anywhere that states this, other than the fact that it's on Wikipedia. And the only place that Wikipedia points us as evidence for this is a book discussing the prostitution laws in Athens. So male Athenians, that is, Athenian citizens, couldn't be prostitutes. That was illegal. So therefore it follows that some polis banned homosexual sex? That doesn't follow at all. Epic Treatise from the future here. Turns out Metatron isn't going to give us any evidence to support that prohibition theory, by the way. He's just going to throw that out as an assertion and then just assume that it's true.
And when we say it, we can't even specifically mean homosexuality or same-sex attraction and relationship. Same-sex relationships in a broad sense, because these dynamics are in fact very difficult to navigate when it comes to the classical world. One, we have no documented evidence to assess the overall attitude of ancient Greek society towards woman-to-woman attraction. After all, ancient Greece was a very male-centric society.
That's very true. We have very little to go on when it comes to male Athenians' attitudes towards lesbians or sexual contact between women. The little we do have does suggest they're a little bit suspicious of it, but we have so little to go on that it's impossible to draw any firm conclusions about that.
It is unclear how such relationships between same-sex partners were regarded in the general society, especially for women. Oxford Classical Dictionary, entry on homosexuality, pages 720 to 723.
That quote doesn't appear in the current edition of the OCD. I don't know if there's a much older edition which may phrase it that way, but the current edition makes it very clear that homosexuality was an accepted part of Greek culture.
But what about the Greek poetess Sappho, Metatron? Oh yeah, I'll talk about it too. I'll talk about everything today. The majority of what you read that may imply, focus on the may, a sexual relationship between males has to do with Pederasty or Pederasty, so a grown man with an adolescent boy, sometimes as young as 12. Quote, the age limit for pederasty in ancient Greece seems to encompass, at the minimum end, boys of 12 years of age. To love a boy below the age of 12 was considered inappropriate. Thank the gods.
When he says quote there, what he's quoting is Wikipedia. Not a modern piece of scholarship, not an ancient source, Wikipedia. And Wikipedia itself doesn't give any references at all for that assertion. I can't find anything in any work of modern literature or in ancient sources to support this idea that it applied to boys as young as 12. I just don't know where they're getting that from. But Metatron is going to assert that that is a fact.
After having read this, do you still want to attach the word beautiful and natural to it? Well, let me tell you, the only way you could do that if you added the infamous P at the end of LGBTQ+, which I know you guys don't want to.
It is one of the uncomfortable facts about studying history that basically all pre-modern societies considered sexual maturity and puberty to be coterminous. That is, that they thought young teenagers who had gone through puberty were sexually mature. We see this throughout history. You can go right up through to the late medieval or Renaissance world and see girls as young as 13, 14, even younger, being married to much older men. This does feel uncomfortable to us in the 21st century. And you can, if you wish, attach the term paedophilia to it. But the fact is, they viewed sexual maturity, adulthood, in a very different way to how we view it. Placing a judgment on that isn't very helpful. It's just a different way of thinking about the world. One could equally judge Emma by Jane Austen. There, the 19-year-old protagonist, Emma, eventually ends up marrying the 40-something-year-old Mr. Knightley. That seems a bit uncomfortable to us. But to a female author of the late 18th century, that didn't seem uncomfortable at all. Attitudes towards ages and age differences differ in the past. It's not helpful to judge them for that.
Definitely wasn't a paradise for the kids, underaged, often non-consensual boys. If anything, when pederasty did involve sexual relationship, which wasn't always the case, it would have resulted in PTSD for the boy.
So I'm not really sure what point Metatron's trying to make here. So is he saying that we have no evidence for widespread PTSD in the ancient world, and therefore men can't have been having sex with young boys, or at least not commonly? Okay, but that would only be a problem for the assertion that they were having sex with lots of quite young boys. If we reject that assertion, then it becomes less of a problem. There is a major problem with this, though, that we don't see evidence of significant amounts of PTSD amongst the young girls of historical societies who are married very young. If in these societies having sex young was regularly causing PTSD, why don't we see evidence of that amongst the young women of these pre-modern societies?
Not something I'd call, open quotes, beautiful and natural expression of love and desire.
Metatron apparently can't read. It says these Greek sculptures and paintings were seen as natural expressions of love and desire. That would not be affected by whether or not the youths they were having sex with had PTSD. The sculptures and paintings could still be seen as natural representations of love.
But the older man would give them gifts, so yeah, still no. Adult to adult, man to man relationships where two equal partners love each other and perhaps even want to get married and share their lives of love together were not accepted at a societal level in ancient Greece.
Yes, so he struck there on one of the really interesting differences between ancient and modern homosexuality. It is true that men in ancient Greece were absolutely expected to maintain their duty to the polis of producing more children, producing more citizens for the polis. So no, you were not expected to spend your life and marry your male lover, because you needed to have a wife and you needed to produce more children for the polis. And that is indeed one of the significant differences between the way homosexuality is accepted in the modern world and the way it was accepted in the ancient world.
And whenever we see mentions of it, very seldomly mind you, they were often disdained or mocked. There is also the whole aspect of active-passive polarization, in the sense that the two males were not considered equal among them. There was a dominant and a submissive role, and in the case of the submissive one, it was associated with lower status.
Yes, indeed, and there was lively debate in the ancient world as to whether Patroclus or Achilles was the subordinate partner in their relationship.
So whenever in these articles they mention ancient Greece, so they're saying in ancient Greece this, in ancient Greece that, they are presenting a very flat Greece devoid of the cultural and spatial depth, the city-states we have just mentioned, but also temporal depth. No mention of the 8 ages. So what? We are supposed to believe that the Greeks did not change their mind once in the entirety of all the city-states throughout the entirety of their history when it comes to homosexual relationships?
No, I suspect they're just lazily using the term ancient Greece when what they actually mean is classical Greece.
To briefly jump back into literature before moving into religion and starting to talk about the gods, oftentimes Plato is mentioned when trying to bring up this idea that to the ancient Greeks, men-to-men love was the highest form of love. Well, first of all, that's the opinion of Plato.
Whoa, that note on the screen is very interesting. If you haven't seen the first part of this, I would go back and watch it. One of the things that Metatron said in that part was that Xenophon could be demonstrated to not support the love between two men because of something he put into the mouth of Socrates in his Symposium. However, here, now that Plato is putting into the mouth of not just one of his characters in the Symposium, in fact, all of the characters in the Symposium express their support for the love between two men, and one of them even says it is the highest form of love. Now he's saying maybe it's the voice of the character, and that's not Plato's opinion. It's a very interesting double standard.
And the opinion of one person doesn't necessarily reflect the opinion of the entirety of the country. I mean, Americans know a thing or two about that. Second, if we look at why he thinks so, is because he thinks that male-to-male relationships have a sort of formative educational structure to them as well, which means that he's specifically talking about, once again, pederasty.
What about during the discussions about Patroclus and Achilles, or about the tyrant slayers Harmodius and Aristogeiton? They might use pederastic language, but they're talking about relationship between two grown adults.
The mentor and the pupil. He's not talking about two 40-year-old guys that want to get married. Third, this is probably the most laughable thing of all of these, no one mentions the fact that Plato actually changed his mind completely towards the end of his career. So when you read his later writings, 360, they don't say that. I think that's something you do need to mention if you want to use Plato's words. Otherwise it becomes cherry picking. There you go.
So I think what Metatron is referring to here is a couple of passages in Plato's Laws where he puts in the mouth of his Athenian character words as the effect that overweening passion and desire has caused many of the problems that they've seen in their society, and therefore passion and desire would be better restrained in some way. And that includes passion between men, but also, for example, men's love for hetairae, courtesans. So to say that he completely changed his mind later in life about homosexuality because in general he believed that self-control and control over one's desires was an important virtue is just absurd.
Now this brings up the elephant in the room that I've mentioned a few times, pederasty. Couple more things to say about that. So when you read period authors, pederasty was not and did not always involve sex. In fact, according to several authors, it wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to be an educational relationship, a mentor-pupil relationship. But of course, some wealthy, powerful and well-connected men took advantage of that. Well, Metatron, that's a bold statement. If that were the case, wouldn't classical authors tell us about it? Yes, they did. Herodotus, Plato, Xenophon and Athenaeus, among others. In his Symposium, Plato tells us that parents would hire bodyguards to protect their children from old men. We are also told that other children would often mock another youth caught up in a pederastic relationship. Why would they mock them if it was accepted?
Breaking news, creepy old men are creepy, and children make fun of each other.
Since I was mentioning that Plato changed his mind, here are his words. He tells us that pederasty is both shameful and honorable at the same time. It says that when someone is unable to control his lust, it brings shame to him because he's bringing shame on another citizen.
Yep, unrestrained lust was shameful, in Plato's opinion. The object of that shame is largely irrelevant.
We know that all the Stoics were against promiscuity and that they were against homosexual activity. For them, they were not real relationships.
Sorry, how do we know that? Metatron, can we have some references, please?
Xenophon tells us that physical contact between teacher and students was simply unacceptable. And when pederasty went sexual, we are told that it meant to be given to unnatural lust. From Plato's laws, sexual pleasure is held to have been granted by nature to male and female when conjoined for the work of procreation. The crime of male with male or female with female is an outrage of nature and a capital surrender to lust of pleasure.
Yes, one of the characters in Plato's Laws does say that, but do you remember earlier where one of the characters in Plato's Laws was showing their support for the love between two men, and that wasn't Plato's real opinion because it was the opinion of a character? Why doesn't that apply here? And really, the point Plato is making here is that ungoverned lust is bad, and that if you're not having sex to procreate and for the exclusive purpose of procreation, then you will tend to be led into ungoverned lust.
Plato tells us that it's lust towards boys inciting and renewing the desire it gratifies. Aristotle tells us there are brutish characteristics and other such characteristics arise through illness as well as through madness in some cases, like the man who made a sacrifice of his mother and ate her, and in addition to these, the pleasure of sex with males.
So that's just a rubbish translation. What Aristotle is trying to explain there is why some men enjoy being penetrated by other men, when they should enjoy being the penetrator, in his view.
The ancient Roman Claudius Aelianus tells us in Varia Historia, Spartan love had nothing base because neither the boy dared to accept lewdness nor the lover dared to be lewd, since it was no good for any of them to dishonor Sparta. If this ever happened, they were either exiled or, what was worse, killed.
Who cares what a Roman from the 3rd century AD thought about what was happening in Sparta in the 5th century BC?
Plato laws, no one should dare have sex with the brave and free by their own wife, nor should be allowed to have illegitimate offsprings by concubines or childless, and unnatural intercourse with men. Even better, sexual intercourse between men should be once and for all prohibited.
So I can only find this quote in some obscure Christian websites online. I've no idea what it's supposed to be a translation of, but it doesn't seem to bear any resemblance to anything Plato ever wrote.
When it comes to religion, the situation becomes even sillier. Let's look at the gods. Aphrodite has a husband and many men lovers. Athena is chaste. Ares has a wife. Zeus has a wife, Hera, although he also goes around and basically has sex with as many human females as he possibly can.
And Ganymede, the male hero, Ganymede.
I love it how some activists even bring up the story of Cyproites, the man who allegedly saw Artemis, the goddess of hunt, naked in the woods and then is turned into a woman. And they say that that's a representation of modern day transgender. And of course they leave out the fact that he was turned into a woman as a punishment for having seen the goddess naked. They're not gonna tell you that.
I've never heard anyone make that claim. The original article that he was complaining about doesn't make that claim. I don't know what he's complaining about here.
Poseidon fell in love for a nymph, Hades had Persephone, Eros and Psyche, and I can go on.
Yep, the gods were in heterosexual marriages. As I said before, men who were in relationships with men were also expected to marry women and produce heirs, produce citizens for the polis.
Another incorrect notion is this connection that they constantly make in this article between love and desire. You see, even though in the modern era we do tend to connect sexual desire and love as one whole beautiful thing.
Do we? I'm pretty sure we think love and desire are different things.
In ancient Greece that wasn't the case, and associating love and desire and putting them together is historically incorrect. The Greeks didn't put them together. In fact, they divided them even in the realm of the 12 Olympians and the gods in general. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty. Eros was the god of desire. And oftentimes in the minds of the ancient Greeks, sexual desire was something that needed to be controlled, and if you lost control, it was shameful. But as you noticed earlier on the video, I mentioned medical texts. Well, this is the smoking GUN of this video. Get ready. Several physicians of the time, and we have all of this documented, tried to explain why people were homosexual. Some said that they act contrary to their nature. Others say it's a disease. Others consider it to be a mental illness. Others say it's even a birth defect. Do I agree with any of these? No, I don't. But does that mean that I'm not going to mention them? No, because that would be being intellectually dishonest.
No, intellectual dishonesty would be claiming there are a bunch of medical texts which say that homosexuality is a disease or a birth defect without actually mentioning any of those medical texts. Now, I'm pretty sure that's because they don't exist, and what you're actually doing is misquoting the Aristotle quote from earlier. But I'm happy to be disproved on that. I've just never seen any of these medical texts in all my time in ancient history.
Which is precisely what they are being, writing these articles, ignoring completely every single word written by physicians of the time, who were also ancient Greeks. So, however you want to see it, considering ancient Greek as the LGBTQ paradise is very much of a myth. That doesn't mean that homosexuality wasn't a thing, of course it existed, but it wasn't considered as the highest form of love encouraged by all ancient Greeks. The same. This is such a simplistic two-dimensional and, after all, incorrect statement within a three-dimensional, extremely deep topic that it really disrespects the Greeks.
I think it disrespects the Greeks to just lie about what they wrote about, as you have been in this video.
This kind of approach is a disgrace.
Well said.
As I was saying, the only hint of lesbianism is the eponymic Lesbos of Sappho. The poems, however, are very few. And the conclusion you draw as reading it is that it's not 100% certain that that poem are from the point of view of Sappho, the author, or if it's the words of a character who would be a man.
What? Nobody has ever suggested. In fact, it is absurd to suggest that the poems of Sappho might be in the male voice. They're just not. I mean, potentially you could make the Lardinois argument that these are poems that are meant to be sung by groups of women at public events and are not private poems from the voice of Sappho herself. But even that's not particularly convincing. These are very passionate, very personal poems. I'm just not convinced even by that argument.
Also, Sappho had a husband. That doesn't automatically mean that she wasn't a lesbian, but it's, once again, another stretch.
Homosexuality wasn't the same in the ancient world to the modern world. This is something you said yourself at the beginning of this video. You just seem to have forgotten. Yes, the people in the ancient world who enjoyed the opposite sex also got married. This bizarre binary you have between a gay person who's only a gay person if they only have sex with men and never have any contact with the opposite sex, or a gay woman is only a gay woman if she only has sex with women and never has any contact with the opposite sex. This is absurd. This doesn't even work in the modern world, and it certainly doesn't work in the ancient world. So I ended the last episode of this by saying that Metatron basically has no knowledge of the ancient world. And while I still think he knows comparatively little about the ancient world, I'm increasingly of the opinion that he's actually being actively dishonest. Look at all the occasions where he's looking at texts that show support for or actually express desire for a homosexual relationship or at least sexual contact with a member of the same sex. He explains these as voices of a character, not the opinions of the author themselves. But then, when he's talking about people criticising homosexuality, even when that's in the voice of a character, he says that is the real opinion of the author. This is a deliberate double standard. He's just being dishonest. And it becomes really clear when he's talking about Sappho, this idea that Sappho's poems are somehow in the voice of a male character, which literally doesn't work. And so I really do feel like he's being actively dishonest here. He's trying to produce a picture of the Greek world that fits his own worldview, or fits a worldview that he thinks will be popular with his audience, against the facts of the case by obscuring the details of these sources. All in all, this is a terrible analysis of the sources, when he does any analysis at all, or even mentions the names of the sources, like his invented medical writers. Anyway, I'm going to sign off now. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I've been Epic Treatise, and I'll see you soon.